9:40 p.m. A quiet rooftop behind a glittering fundraiser gala. The city lights shimmer like fallen stars, cold and distant. A 39-year-old single dad stands by the railing, holding a glass of water. He feels out of place in his rented tuxedo, a man of calloused hands and honest silence. Beside him, a 31-year-old woman in a stunning red dress looks down at her hands. She is the billionaire sponsor, the woman everyone calls untouchable. Then she whispers 6 words that shatter the night. "I've never been kissed." He freezes. He thought he misheard her, but her eyes are raw with truth. What he chooses to do next will matter more than any kiss. Elias was a man defined by the quiet spaces in his life. At 39, his world was a carefully constructed fortress of routine and responsibility. He had been a widower for 5 long years, a stretch of time that felt like both an eternity and a single, blurred afternoon. His days were spent managing the maintenance and technical infrastructure of a large event center, a job that required him to be the invisible hand that ensured everything ran perfectly while staying out of the spotlight. His hands were thick, marked by the honest labor of fixing broken things, and his eyes carried a permanent sort of weariness that only those who have raised a child alone truly understand. The gala was held in the very building he had practically revived. 2 weeks ago, a violent summer storm had blown the main transformers, plunging the heritage site into a dangerous blackout during a wedding rehearsal. Elias had worked 36 hours straight in the flooded basement, his knees in cold water, his fingers numbed by the vibration of heavy machinery, until the lights flickered back to life. It was that act of gritty, uncredited heroism that had earned him an invitation, not from the management, but from the historical society that recognized he was the building's true heartbeat. His center of gravity was his 11-year-old son, Leo. Before Elias had left for the gala that evening, Leo had looked up from his comic books and given him a rare, toothy grin. "Try to smile tonight, Dad," the boy had said. "You look like you're going to a funeral, not a party." Elias had tried to take that advice to heart, but as he stood in the corner of the ballroom watching billionaires discuss philanthropy, he felt more like a ghost than a guest. He didn't date. He didn't flirt. He didn't know how to navigate a world where people spoke in subtext and wore masks of perfect confidence. The tuxedo he wore felt like a costume, the stiff collar scratching at a neck used to flannel and work shirts. He watched the waiters glide past with trays of champagne he couldn't name, listening to the cacophony of wealth that felt entirely alien to his reality of grocery lists and parent-teacher conferences. Then, there was Clara. At 31, she was the primary sponsor of the entire gala, a woman whose name was whispered with equal parts admiration and envy. She was successful, fiercely independent, and possessed a brand of beauty that seemed almost crystalline, sharp, brilliant, and seemingly untouchable. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, nodding to donors and shaking hands with politicians. Yet there was a glass wall between her and the rest of the world. People assumed she was arrogant, or perhaps just too busy for the trivialities of human connection. To the cameras, she was a statue of perfection. To the business world, she was a predator in silk, but Elias had seen her differently. Earlier that evening, he had noticed her standing near a service door, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes for just a second too long. It wasn't the look of a queen surveying her kingdom. It was the look of a person who was suffocating in plain sight. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, as she adjusted her diamond bracelet, a nervous tick that contradicted her calm exterior. He saw her glance at the exit with a hunger that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with escape. The two of them had ended up on the roof by accident. He had gone there to escape the noise. She had gone there to escape the expectations. The roof was a vast, open space of gravel and ventilation units, smelling of rain and asphalt. When she stepped out, she didn't see him at first. She simply stood there, letting the wind whip her hair across her face, her shoulders finally dropping from their rigid posture. They didn't start with romance. They started with the mundane. They talked about the city's changing skyline. They talked about the crushing weight of work. Elias told her about Leo's obsession with space travel, and Clara laughed. A real, genuine sound that didn't belong in a boardroom. He wants to find a planet where the silence is absolute, Elias said. I think he's tired of the noise down here, too. I bet he's brave, she had said, leaning her elbows on the cold stone railing. Kids usually are before the world tells them not to be, before they learn that every move is judged and every failure is documented. He is, Elias replied. He's braver than I am. He handles the silence of the house better than his old man does. Sometimes I find him sitting in his room without the lights on, just looking at the stars through his telescope. He says they don't ask anything of him. They just shine. They weren't flirting. There was no calculated pursuit, no witty banter designed to impress. It was just two people standing in the dark, sharing the truth of their exhaustion. Clara had spent her life in a gilded cage of extreme family control. Her parents hadn't just raised her. They had curated her. Every friend had been vetted. Every achievement had been measured against a standard of perfection that left no room for vulnerability. She had grown up in an environment where physical affection was seen as a weakness and where being untouchable was the ultimate goal. She was a product of a lineage that valued preservation over passion. The silence stretched out between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when the small talk is finally exhausted and the real conversation is waiting to begin. Elias took a sip of his water, watching the red light of a distant radio tower blink rhythmically. He felt a strange ease in her presence, perhaps because he knew he had nothing she wanted and she had nothing he needed to fix. Except, perhaps, the invisible weight on her chest. Clara's voice broke the stillness again, but this time the tone was different. It was heavy with a confession she had clearly carried for a decade. It was the kind of secret that grows heavier the longer it is kept, turning from a simple fact into a psychological barrier. I've never been kissed. The statement hung in the air like a physical object. Elias didn't laugh. He didn't make a joke about how lucky the first guy would be. He didn't even move closer. He simply remained where he was, processing the weight of what she had just said. He understood immediately that this wasn't about a lack of opportunity. A woman like Clara was approached by men constantly. They swarmed her like moths to a flame, drawn by her money, her power, or her porcelain beauty. This was about a lack of safety. It was about the fact that in her world, every touch had a price tag, and every intimacy was a potential liability. Is that something you're ashamed of? Elias asked softly. He didn't turn to face her yet, giving her the space to exist in her own revelation without the pressure of his gaze. He knew about shame, the shame of being the one who lived when his wife didn't. The shame of not being able to explain to a 6-year-old why Mommy wasn't coming home. Clara shook her head, a small, sad movement. Not ashamed, just tired. I'm tired of feeling untouchable, Elias. I'm tired of being the woman everyone wants to be seen with, but no one wants to actually know. My whole life has been a series of boundaries. I built them to stay safe. but now I'm just trapped inside them. When I was 19, I almost let someone in. But then I overheard him talking to his friends about how much market value a relationship with me would add to his father's firm. I realized then that I wasn't a person to them. I was a merger. She explained the reality of her upbringing. In her world, a kiss wasn't just a kiss. It was a strategic move. It was a headline. It was a loss of leverage. She had spent her 20s terrified that if she let anyone close enough to touch her, they would find the cracks in the porcelain. She feared that the moment someone saw the girl beneath the CEO, they would realize she was just as lost and frightened as anyone else, and they would use that vulnerability against her. So she chose to stay perfect. And in staying perfect, she stayed alone. Elias felt a surge of empathy that caught him off guard. He knew what it was like to live behind walls. Since his wife's passing, he had used his son and his work as a shield. He had told himself he was protecting Leo, but in reality, he was protecting himself from the possibility of losing someone again. He had convinced himself that romantic love was a luxury for people who didn't have ghosts in their hallways. He and Clara were on opposite sides of the same coin, one isolated by tragedy, the other by expectation. "Everyone looks at me and sees a success story," Clara whispered, her grip tightening on the railing until her knuckles turned white. "But I feel like I've missed the most basic parts of being human. I've never known what it's like to just belong to someone, without a contract, without a reputation, without wondering if they're looking at my bank account while they're looking at my eyes." And this was the emotional micro-peak of their meeting. Clara wasn't asking for a kiss. She was asking to be seen. She was confessing that her independence was a mask for her loneliness. Elias looked at her then, seeing the vulnerability that the red dress and the expensive jewelry were supposed to hide. He saw a woman who was successful in everything except the one thing that mattered, feeling safe in her own skin. He saw the child who was never allowed to be messy, the teenager who was never allowed to be impulsive, and the woman who was never allowed to be loved. The wind picked up, turning colder as the night deepened, whistling through the gaps in the stone balustrade. The gala downstairs was winding down, the muffled thud of the bass from the band reaching them like a distant heartbeat. But the air on the roof was thick with a new kind of tension. Not the tension of lust, but of profound human recognition. Clara turned to face him, her eyes searching his, looking for a judgment that wasn't there. "Would it be strange," she started, her voice trembling slightly, the cold finally reaching her bones. "Would it be strange if I wanted my first kiss to mean something? If I didn't want it to be a mistake or a drunken moment at a party? If I wanted it to be the one thing in my life that wasn't planned by a committee?" Elias looked at her for a long time. He could feel the pull of the moment. He was a man who hadn't felt the touch of a woman in years. And here was a beautiful, brilliant soul, offering him the most intimate piece of her history. He could smell her perfume, something subtle, like jasmine after rain. Most men would have taken the opportunity. Most men would have leaned in, convinced that they were the hero of the story, who would finally break the spell. They would have seen it as a trophy to be won, a secret to be claimed. But Elias wasn't most men. He saw the way she was looking at him, like a person standing on the edge of a cliff, hoping someone would either catch her or tell her to step back. He realized that if he kissed her now, in the shadow of a party, under the influence of her own sudden vulnerability, he would just be another person taking something from her. He would be participating in the very impulsiveness she feared would make the moment cheap. "Then don't give it away tonight," Elias said, His voice was steady, firm, and filled with a profound respect. Clara blinked, her expression shifting to one of genuine shock. Her breath hitched. She had expected a move. She had prepared herself for the usual script, the lean in, the hand on the waist, the predictable escalation. What? Moments shouldn't be rushed just because they sound poetic in the dark, Elias continued. He stepped back slightly, creating a clear, respectful distance. You've waited this long because you wanted it to be real. You've guarded that part of yourself with everything you have. If I kiss you now, right here, it's just a reaction to a conversation. It's a response to a confession. You deserve more than a reaction, Clara. You deserve a memory that isn't clouded by a fundraiser or a tight tuxedo, or the fear that you only said it because you were lonely for an hour. This was the true emotional peak. For the first time in Clara's life, a man had looked at her and valued her boundaries more than his own desires. He wasn't trying to fix her, and he wasn't trying to claim her. He was protecting her truth. He was telling her that her weight had value, and that he respected her enough to let her keep her secret until the setting was as worthy as the sentiment. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a release of pressure she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The untouchable woman felt, for the first time, truly touched, but not by a hand. She was touched by his integrity. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She felt a strange, soaring sense of relief. He had seen her, and he had chosen her dignity over his own satisfaction. I think, Clara said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her mask, a smile that didn't belong on a magazine cover because it was too raw, too real. That you are the most unusual man I have ever met, Elias Thorne. I'm just a guy who knows that once you give something away, you can't get it back, he replied. I've spent 5 years wishing I could get back the last 10 minutes I had with my wife, just to say one more thing. I know the value of last and first. I'll walk you down. Your car is probably waiting. They left the roof together, but they didn't leave each other's lives. Over the next few weeks, the relationship grew in the most unconventional ways. There were no grand dates at 5-star restaurants where the waiters hovered like ghosts. Instead, they met at the park while Leo played soccer. They sat on splintered wooden benches and drank lukewarm coffee from paper cups. They talked about things that mattered, fears, regrets, and the small joys of everyday life. Clara learned about the struggle of raising a son who was smarter than his teachers, and Elias learned about the girl who used to hide in the library to avoid her etiquette lessons. Clara began to shed the armor of the major sponsor. She started wearing jeans and sneakers, clothing that allowed her to blend into the world rather than stand above it. She started visiting Elias's small, lived-in house, a place where the air smelled of old books and cinnamon toast. She saw the way he cared for Leo, the way he listened to the boy's endless stories about black holes and supernovas. She saw a life that was built on a foundation of honesty, not image. And Elias began to realize that his heart wasn't as dead as he had thought. He found himself looking forward to her texts, to the way she challenged his cynical view of the world. He found himself cleaning the grease from under his fingernails with more care before she arrived. As the months passed, the metaphor of replanting became the central theme of their connection. Their love wasn't a wildfire. It was a slow-burning hearth. One Saturday afternoon, Leo decided he wanted to plant a small maple tree in the corner of their modest backyard. He had bought a sapling with his allowance, a spindly thing that looked like it might blow away in a strong breeze, its leaves a pale, hopeful green. Clara was there, kneeling in the dirt alongside the boy. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. her expensive manicure forgotten as she dug into the cool, damp earth. She helped him dig the hole, showing him how to loosen the roots so the tree could breathe. "Why do you look so nervous around my dad sometimes?" Leo asked, with the brutal honesty that only an 11-year-old can possess. He was patting the dirt down with a small plastic shovel. Clara paused, a handful of rich soil in her palm. She looked over at Elias, who was busy setting up a sprinkler nearby, his back turned, though she knew he was listening. She laughed softly. "Because your dad is a very important person, Leo. And sometimes, when something is important, you're afraid you might break it. You're afraid you might not be enough for it." "Dad's not breakable," Leo said firmly, looking at the sapling. "He's like this tree. He just needs a little bit of help to grow again. He's had a lot of winter, Clara, but I think it's spring now." The metaphor wasn't lost on Clara. She realized that she and Elias were both in a process of slow, deliberate growth. They were learning that affection didn't have to be a transaction. It didn't have to be a performance. It could be as simple as helping a child plant a tree or sharing a quiet meal while the sun went down. She was learning that her untouchability was just a lack of context. With Elias, she had context. She was the woman who liked her eggs scrambled hard and who was secretly terrified of spiders. She was a person, not a headline. One evening, they found themselves back on that same rooftop. The event center had hired Elias to do a full overhaul of the emergency systems, and Clara had come to bring him dinner. The building was empty now, the gala a distant memory. There were no lights, no music, no crowds, just the two of them and the silent city. The radio tower was still blinking its rhythmic red warning. "I realized something," Clara said, her voice stronger now, filled with a new kind of confidence. She wasn't hiding behind her hair anymore. "I don't want my first kiss to fix me, Elias. I don't want it to be a magic spell that turns me into a different person. I don't want it to be the end of the story. I just want it to be honest. I want it to be a choice I make because I'm ready to be seen. Not because I'm empty, but because I'm full, and I want to share it." Elias stood beside her, his hand resting near hers on the railing, the heat from his skin radiating across the small gap. But he still didn't touch her. He respected the sanctity of the wait. "Then let it happen when you're not afraid," he said. "Let it happen when it feels like the most natural thing in the world. Like breathing. No pressure. No expectations. Just two people being human." They were building a new foundation, one brick of trust at a time. They were proving that love wasn't about the explosive moments or the cinematic gestures that fade as soon as the credits roll. It was about the quiet consistency of showing up. It was about the respect of waiting. Clara had spent 31 years being untouchable, but with Elias, she was finally learning how to be reached. She was learning that being known was the only way to be truly loved. The end of the story didn't happen on a stage or in front of a cheering crowd. It didn't happen under a spotlight or a firework-filled sky. It happened on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a few months later. The world was moving at its usual pace, cars honking in the distance, a neighbor's lawnmower humming, the scent of blooming lilacs in the air. Elias was in his backyard, cleaning up the tools from a small repair job on the porch. The air was warm, smelling of cut grass and the coming summer. Clara had stopped by after work, still wearing her professional clothes, a sharp gray blazer, but with her hair down, looking relaxed and at peace. She had kicked off her heels and was walking through the grass barefoot, her toes curling into the cool blades. She walked up to him, stopping just a foot away. The sunlight caught the gold flecks in her eyes. She didn't whisper this time. She didn't look down at her hands. She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm not afraid anymore, Elias," she said. It wasn't a confession. It was a declaration. There was no hesitation. No dramatic music swelled in the background. No frantic grasping. Elias simply set down his wrench and wiped his hands on his jeans, a gesture of respect for the moment. He stepped into her space, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every second to change her mind. He didn't ask for permission with words, but his eyes asked the question, and her steady gaze gave him the answer he had been waiting for. He leaned in, and the kiss was light. It was soft, almost hesitant at first, like a conversation between two people who were finally speaking the same language. It tasted like sunlight and the promise of a long, quiet life. It wasn't a Hollywood climax. It wasn't a sweeping, passionate embrace that made the world stop spinning. It was something much better. It was an agreement. It was a moment of absolute trust. It was the sound of a wall finally coming down, not with a crash, but with a gentle sigh. It didn't last for an eternity. When they pulled apart, Clara didn't look like she had been transformed by magic. She didn't look like a different person. She just looked like herself, but lighter. The weight of being the girl who had never been kissed was gone, replaced by the reality of being a woman who was loved for exactly who she was. The untouchable label had been washed away by a single, honest act. "That," Clara whispered, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek, a tear of joy and release, "was exactly what it was supposed to be. Thank you for waiting for me." "I told you," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, his thumb catching the tear before it could fall. "It was worth the wait. You were always worth the wait." In the background, Leo ran across the yard, chasing a soccer ball and shouting for his dad to come and play. The sapling they had planted was already showing new buds, its roots deep and secure in the earth. Clara laughed and wiped her eye, the sound echoing through the quiet suburb. The untouchable woman was gone. The lonely single dad was a memory. They were just two people who had chosen to walk slowly, to value the truth over the moment, and to build a home out of honesty. She had whispered that she had never been kissed, and he had chosen to protect that truth until she was ready to share it. Because sometimes, real love isn't about taking the moment for yourself. It's about waiting until the moment feels like home. If this story reminded you that the best things in life are worth waiting for, please support us at High TL Stories. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to know that their timing is perfect. Tell us in the comments, what is something you're glad you waited for? Let's celebrate the slow growth together. See you in the next story.